This is a short reel.
Hi, this is Charles. Ryan is currently scouring the neighboring towns for canned sardines and hand sanitizer, but he'll be joining us later in the show. Tonight, we're going to listen to a deleted scene from last week's episode about the cabin location in the Tennessee woods for the Evil Dead. And then, we're heading to the outer reaches of the California wilderness for a brush with the infinite in an after-hours drive-in picture show viewing of Resolution. Sometimes you just have to cut fun stuff out of your show. Maybe your episode is running long. We've had that happen. Or maybe you need to cut a passage because it just goes too far afield of the story. You go so far into the weeds that you risk obscuring the film story you're trying to convey. That's what happened with tonight's deleted scene. It was information that we thought was fascinating, but our producer Markham thought it just took too long for me to spit it out. And once you hear it, you'll probably agree with him. It's okay. We're all friends here. You can admit it. Well, we're not as good of friends now that you've admitted it, but you know what? Let's move on. You will recognize parts of the following conversation from last week's episode, but probably 85% of it was cut out. Enjoy. This cabin's perfect for this movie. I mean, it wasn't the original choice for setting. They had another place that fell through right before they started shooting, and they had to go around and scout other locations at the very last minute. Campbell tells this story in his book, and I think also in the commentary for this movie, about scouting locations when the original one fell through, and they went to this cottage resort from the 1920s that had been abandoned out there. And their film commission rep said, hey, you might want to stay here. I'll go up and knock and see what's going on. Because he knew that there would be squatters in there. And so Campbell talked about how, he knocked on the door and they said, yeah, come on in. And they went in. He said that they were super nice people. They'd say, here, have a seat, drink a while, or whatever. He said, but he had lived in Michigan all his life. He had never seen poverty like that. He had just never seen somebody who was living in such a condition. But I guess at this location, the one that they ended up settling on, had its share of weird stuff, even beyond them shooting their stuff here. According to Campbell's memoir, supposedly there was a girl named Clara who lived in the cabin in the 30s with her parents. And one night during this really bad thunderstorm, both of her parents were murdered, brutally murdered. And no one could explain who had done it or why. And by the time they were getting ready to film Evil Dead, Clara was an old woman, and I guess she was living in a rest home nearby called Morristown Manor. And supposedly, whenever there was a horrible storm, she would wander away from the home and go out into the woods, searching for her parents. And according to Campbell, they actually found her meandering through the woods right behind the cabin just a few days before the cast and crew arrived to begin filming.
Wow.
So the place really kind of has this weird history. They also had some problems with people breaking in and stealing their power tools. Luckily, they left the camera, which is like a $20,000 camera. But they didn't have any use for it, right? So they were just kind of like, well, why do I, who cares how much that's worth? But there are a few stories. Can I tell a couple stories about this place? Okay. Yeah. So after the power tool theft, they had to have people sleeping in the cabin. Right? They decided one of us is going to stay back and sleep in the cabin every night to ward off any potential thieves. The rest of the cast and crew, they were all staying back at this one house. It was 5 or 6 bedrooms. And so Raimi, one night, it was his turn to sleep at the cabin. He's there sleeping. In the middle of the night, he feels this draft. And so he wakes up, and there's a guy sitting next to him drinking moonshine, just sitting there.
Oh, weird.
And so he got up and got out of the cabin and went up to sleep in their little makeshift graveyard up there, outside. And when they came in the next day, they found him sleeping up there, freezing. And he had said, I'm never sleeping in there again. And he never said, I guess the guy was probably real, but the way that they told the story, it really felt like that guy could have been a ghost or something.
Oh, shit.
The other one that I thought was funny while they were really shooting was Campbell, I guess, one morning he was walking up the driveway because basically that driveway that led up to the cabin got to a point that they really couldn't drive their cars down it because it got really icy and slick. Like, it'd get really muddy, and then when it got really cold, it would get really slick. And so they'd have to bring things down the driveway by hand. So they'd have to carry all the equipment stuff down there that they had to carry.
Yeah.
And Campbell said he was walking down there one day, and it was the night that Raimi was actually sleeping at the cabin the night before. And so he comes down there in the morning, and he passes this guy who's got this huge bushy beard, and he's got like a bandolier across his chest with like ammunition in it. He's got what Campbell said was the biggest shotgun he'd ever seen. And he passed the guy, and Campbell just said, "Good morning." And the guy just kind of nodded and walked on. And Raimi, I think this was on the commentary, they were talking about this. Raimi was just like, you just said, you thought this guy probably killed me, and you just said good morning to him? and Campbell's like, well, I didn't want to make things worse.
Right.
And Raimi called him like a son of a bitch or something. But yeah. And the last story that I thought was really funny about this location was that they all had to sleep there for the last week or so filming because the house that they were staying in apparently was going to be turned into a brothel. And so they were actually getting all their shit out while people were moving brass beds in for the brothel.
Whoa.
So they had to go and sleep in the cabin for the last week or so. And I guess that they would then, like, to keep warm, they would basically break up whatever furniture wasn't needed for shots and burn it in the fireplace all night.
Oh, my gosh.
So I think that place burned down not too long after they finished filming there, in maybe late 1980. And all that was left was the fireplace and the chimney. And I heard that Campbell said that he would have people show up for years afterwards at horror conventions and stuff and have like a rock and say, this is from the fireplace there. And he always wondered why people didn't find the time capsule that they buried a time capsule there right under the fireplace.
Oh, wow.
That had like a fake blood container in it and something about the movie, about how to figure out the movie, like some sort of key to understanding the movie a little bit deeper or something, and a couple of other things.
Huh.
But he said, who knows if it's still there?
Right.
Now that
the word's out, somebody probably dug it up.
Somebody's probably dug it up, and that chimney's probably, and the fireplace are probably gone by now. But sorry, the place is fascinating.
Yeah.
I didn't know where else to talk about this stuff because I thought the stories around it were just so fascinating that, like, this movie had to be shot there pretty much. It was such a weird little place.
Yeah. That's awesome.
I don't know what this movie would be without this location.
Right.
So in that way, I feel like this movie and the next movie, once we talk about Evil Dead 2, we could get into it. But these two movies, I feel like, share similar things with Texas Chainsaw Massacre 1 and 2.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, definitely.
In this movie, you can feel the hardship on screen. I mean, they kind of laugh about the torture of making this movie and how hard it was and kind of things that they had to do. But, pretty much all the actors that were in this, besides Bruce Campbell, either left acting completely or left it for a while. It took them a while to get back into it again.
Yeah.
Because it was a brutal experience. So, again, it's kind of like, where's the line?
Right.
Where do you stop that?
Like, it's quiet out here at night, doesn't it?
It's like you just started working here. I mean, if you didn't clock in late and clock out early every single shift.
Well, dude, I can't help it. I'm a very, very busy man.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you picked us in for the movie tonight. That's very nice of you.
I'll do what I can.
I'm not used to being treated so well by your schedule.
If you'd spend more time trying to schedule around me than schedule without me, maybe I could attend more of these short reels.
Maybe we should just announce that to the patrons next time they come in. If we could just schedule this weekend's activities around right.
Our first feature will start around 8 or 9.
Will you just set up the damn chairs? I'm going to tell these people what we're watching tonight.
Fine.
Tonight on the After Hours Drive-In Picture Show, it's tweakers, dealers, killers, a shifty mortgage broker, a barn full of antique media devices, and a UFO cult. Oh, and there's also an entity that wants you to tell its stories. Join us for Resolution. Attention patrons! The movies discussed on this podcast will be spoiled from start to finish. If you wish to experience these cinematic gems visually, please do so before continuing with this episode. We will be right here when you return. Thank you, and have a pleasant evening.
Chris, it's Michael, your best friend. Can I come up?
Yeah, man.
Okay, I'm coming up, all right? Don't shoot!
All I'm asking is that you get clean for 1 week.
No.
Well, all right.
Really? Mike, what are you doing?
Look, I know this is a dark moment, but it does get better. This is the worst of it, okay? Where did this come from? Found this library book on our doorstep. What was that?
Mike, it's an old house. It's gonna make noise sometimes.
The people come here to look for aliens, ghosts and cults and gateways to hell,
What was that?
looking into other dimensions.
Dude, you keep coming here with these recordings and these stupid stories about how you found them, and you're acting weird.
I think someone might be messing with us.
Maybe you have split personalities and you're leaving each other gifts for you to find.
Did you see that?
See what?
What?
That.
That's satellites. They watch everything.
What's going on, Mike?
If there is something, it is none of these things.
We need to leave before they get here. What would convince you that I'm not crazy?
There are a lot of stories running through Resolution, but the main story focuses on Michael Danube, played by Peter Solella, who tries to forcibly dry out his long-lost addict friend Chris Daniels, played by Vinnie Curran, in a cabin that Chris is squatted in at the edge of an Indian reservation.
And by forcibly, we mean zapping Chris with a taser and handcuffing him to a wall pipe in the cabin on a mattress.
You will dry out.
Yeah. So I guess we should start with how Michael gets to that point. At the beginning of this movie, Michael gets this video through email and like a GPS location map. And the video is of Chris, he's out in the woods and he's in a field and he's shooting guns and playing with a dog and going ape shit.
And it's interesting too because you don't really quite know what's going on. It's like, is he editing together a film he made of his buddy, you know?
Yeah, it's all jump cuts and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really weird.
Can't really tell what's happening there.
So he decides then to leave what we will find out later on is his pregnant wife to go out and find Chris and give one last playoff push to detox him once and for all.
Right.
But the thing about this scene, though, when he's sitting in his office looking at the computer, the camera moves in, but it bumps a little bit. Did you notice that? Like it bumps a little bit. So to me, that informs the end of the movie a little bit.
Right.
When he decides that he's going to carry this thing with him if he goes back home. But in reality, the thing might already be there watching him from the very beginning.
Yeah.
That's one of those things that's not quite explained in this movie. And also, the structure of the rules don't make it so that you can figure out the chicken or the egg scenario.
All you can really... The only thing that really leads you to believe that something is following them or even maybe leading them, aside from the scavenger hunt aspect of it, which I really like, and I know we'll get to that here shortly, but anytime this entity or whatever is basically setting them up for the next move, you'll see like a screen burn bump. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it looks like a projector's about to, like the film's about to burn, but then it recorrects itself.
Right.
So that happens a lot, and at one point it happens, and Chris and Michael both look at each other like, "Did you hear that?"
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Which is kind of funny. So
yeah, it's weird. Like, it's a neat device to use. Like, and I think that's the thing that kind of hooks into, in a way, into Evil Dead. You know, we talked about last week, but it actually kind of builds on the whole idea of the entity in the woods, and we're, you know, seeing through the entity's POV. I like how it builds on that idea. And there are a few connections here between the Evil Dead movies, especially the first two and the remake, and this new movie, right?
Well, the remake came out the same year as Resolution.
Uh-huh.
And unlike the original Evil Dead, where it's a bunch of young people go into a remote cabin to get loaded and have dirty sex, the remake is a group of friends taking another friend to willingly sober her up. She's all for it, and they're just trying to get her clean.
No shit.
Yeah, and so in Resolution, Michael's forcing Chris to sober up by taking him hostage. So that'd be the differences there. But it's kind of funny.
Yeah.
It's just like, you know, it's almost like these two stories are sort of colliding, but maybe like a different dimension sort of.
Yeah,
deal, you know?
yeah. It's like they're talking to each other, which
it
is interesting that coincidence happens in real life, because that's kind of one of the main thrusts of this movie that we'll get into as we go along. The idea of there being possible outcomes in every story, and it's almost like a multiverse type thing.
Yeah.
Which obviously is different from the original Evil Dead and the Evil Dead remake, but it is interesting it's happening in real life. Another connection to Evil Dead is that in this movie, in Resolution, just like in the original Evil Dead, they find a crazy book in the cellar, or Michael does. He finds this crazy book in the cellar and brings it up and opens it up. It looks like a book, but it's more of just a box, right? With photos and stuff in it.
Right.
And photos of people he doesn't know. And I think there might be a one-armed girl in there. I'm not sure. There is a one-armed man later on.
There's a one-armed girl, too. I think they're both in the same film, right?
Well, there's the film, but then in these pictures, I think the girl, because the pictures that he finds, I think has a one-armed girl in it. There's a one-armed girl in one of the films he finds, and then later on when he finds the slides at the library, there's a long-haired, bushy-beard, one-armed man who there are like multiple pictures of him. So that's
true.
I understand as we're talking about this how profoundly confusing this must be for everybody listening. So let's kind of backtrack a little bit and basically lay it out. So Chris is chained to the wall for pretty much the entire movie. You know,
had to be real comfortable.
Yeah. So Michael, once he gets there, he decides he's got to go get food and do whatever, because Chris is a tweaker. Chris is basically a drug addict trying to kill himself by smoking crack until he falls over or whatever.
Right.
But as Michael is there kind of going through the stages of detox with Chris, he wanders a bit. He goes out to take a walk. He goes out and gets groceries for them. He does all this stuff. But as he's out walking in the woods around the cabin, he finds things. He's kind of led to media, different types of media, starting with a film canister, I think.
Yeah.
And then there's a record, and there's videotapes.
And like a photo with another clear screen print that you connect together.
Oh yeah, like a transparency type. Yeah. All these different forms of media, and all these different forms of media have glimpses of various stories that seem to have happened in this whole area. As this is going on, of course, we have the entity whose POV we take from time to time. So sometimes, we see ourselves watching him and the camera's really kind of jittery. You realize that this entity, whatever it is watching him. We never see the entity. We don't know what it looks like. And pretty much like this stuff where media is being dropped for them, that whole thing kind of ramps up as the movie goes along. And instead of seeing stories based on other people, they start seeing stories about how their lives could possibly end, or how the story of this detox week, how it could end.
Becomes almost like a choose your own adventures sort of story.
Exactly. And that's the thing that's so frustrating, is because that's just one story in this movie. There's also the story of Billy and Micah, who are these two tweakers who keep coming to Chris's cabin door and asking him for these drugs that he owes them. And we find out later on that he owes them these drugs because his check didn't come in on time, so he couldn't get his own supply, and they shared with him, and now he owes them. And there's also the story of Charles and his guys. Charles is a Native American casino security guard who owns
played by Zahn McClarnon from Longmire. Dude's great.
That man is amazing. I love him.
He is walking intensity.
He is. One of the most interesting faces in the history of film. Just such an interesting face.
Mm-hmm.
He's so great because he's not really a big guy, but he feels like he's 7 feet tall with the way he projects this bubble of menace around him as
He's got such an intimidating face. It's like, it doesn't matter how big he is, you don't want to screw with him.
Right. I just realized bubble of menace doesn't sound menacing at all. He's got like this...
Aura of menace, maybe?
Yeah, aura. This mystical aura of menace. Yeah. Bubble of menace. Blow these bubbles of menace in your backyard, kids.
I was taking a bath, and there was just a terrible bubble of menace in there with me.
That was gas.
Yeah, absolutely.
But he's fantastic in it. And there's that whole story in that Charles owns the cabin, and he basically comes out early on to rouse them out of the cabin and ends up giving them 5 days after some money and some begging. Gives them 5 days for Chris to clean up and to get the hell out of there, or shit's going to go bad. Mike actually comes across Charles before he knows that he owns the place, because he passes him coming out of like the little grocery or convenience store or whatever. Yeah. But I love that scene where we actually get a proper introduction to Charles for the first time, because it's like Billy and Micah, the tweakers, are at the front door, and Michael's dealing with those two, and then they leave. And as the reason they leave is because Charles and his guys are coming up the way to come up to talk to them. So that kind of switch is so good, because their paths are going to cross later on at the end of the movie.
Right.
And it doesn't work out so well for Billy and Micah, even though they come back later with probably the single biggest wrench I've ever seen. I've never seen a wrench that good in my life.
It's like a gigantic pipe wrench or something.
Yeah. It's like, we're going to fasten this anchor to this battleship. Do you have a wrench for that? I was surprised Billy was carrying it, because it was almost as big as he was.
It'd take 2 hands to swing that thing for sure.
I know. When he brandished it at Michael, I started laughing. I was like, there's no way he's going to be able to swing that.
I was watching that with my son, and I was like, that's a big-ass wrench.
But one thing we should probably get out of the way, because we call this place a cabin, right? So when people think of a cabin, they might think of that creaky-ass old cabin in the Evil Dead movies, or they might think of, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln's Boyhood Home. I don't know what people think. Lincoln Logs. I don't know.
It's more like a shotgun shack, isn't it? Just like
it's weird.
It's like a little tiny, probably 700 square foot house. Yeah.
If it's that big, because it looks like inside it's like one room, but outside, because there's no indoor plumbing or anything, and it's one room, and outside it has siding on it and everything, like it was built in the 80s or something.
But the inside's just stripped to the studs.
It's stripped completely to the studs. They have a weird little deck out front, and then under the house is a cellar that's just basically carved into this rock, and it's wide open in the front. Like there's no door in the cellar or anything. It's just wide open, and there are guns all over a table in there. There's that book box thing that Michael finds down there with all the photos and stuff in it. It's bizarre. And you know what? That place was real. Like that wasn't built or anything. That was just real. I think one of the filmmakers, either his father owned it or somebody in the production, their dad owned that land. And everything that's shot in this movie pretty much, except for the cave and, some of the other stuff like the driving and the grocery scenes and stuff. But the majority of the wooded scenes in this movie are shot within just yards of that cabin. It's just that there are trees and stuff up, so it looks like you're way the hell on out there, when in reality it's all just within a little ways of one another. But regardless of the little acknowledgement thank you at the very end, did you notice that? Like at the very end of the movie, when it goes to black, for a split second, not even a full second, there is a little acknowledgement at the bottom of the screen that thanks an Indian tribe for the footage that they got.
Oh, wow.
And the thing that sucks is that I haven't tried this because this movie is on Amazon Prime at this point. I took a look at the Blu-ray to try to see if I could figure out what that said. I found it impossible to pause on that little screen where you could actually read the Indian reservation acknowledgement.
I wonder why.
Because it wasn't real, and I think that they put it in there to try to just like mess with people's heads, but it wasn't real because this location wasn't on an Indian reservation or anything.
Right.
But it's in there for a second, and then after a little bit, the song starts playing and they do the credits and stuff. But
that's bizarre.
But so we call it a cabin, but it's not like whatever the traditional idea of a cabin. It's not like a log structure or whatever. It's
very, very small house.
Yeah, it's like if somebody built a big shed over a weird open gaping cellar. That's kind of what it is, I guess.
Yeah.
So in his travels here, Mike meets a number of people that don't play parts in the core story, but they kind of add weird color to the outer edges of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he doesn't really meet the mental patient out by the window who taps on the window.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't like her. Yeah, and it's probably just one of the patients from the mental hospital up the road. They always get out.
The new age mental place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. Well, she comes back in the sequel in a totally different way, and she gets a name, and her name's Lizzie, and she's not really, she is kind of scary in the sequel, but she's not really scary. It's really kind of bizarre. We find out that she actually did have some sort of a relationship with Chris, but he doesn't really talk about it in this movie. And so you wonder who's telling the truth and who's not, because she talks about him. And it turns out she's an artist too, so she draws pictures of him in the sequel, which is kind of funny.
Yeah.
We also meet Byron, the creepy Frenchman who lives in a trailer and smokes the red bud, like his red weed or whatever.
Right.
That dude is super creepy.
He is really creepy.
And
really creepy.
He is important to the story because at one point, Billy and Micah, the drug fiends, take shots at Michael, and then they shoot this dog that's been hanging out with Chris and that he really loves, and then he's named Sarah, and then it's not that dog's name. Like it's got a totally different name, and it belongs to this Frenchman who lives in a trailer out by himself in the woods, and he's been living there for 30 years.
And that's an aside on that too. Chris says that the dog and he are writing a book together.
Yeah, and, about squirrels.
Yeah. So when Mike first met the dog, I thought it was funny because he says, "Who are you?" When the dog comes up, I thought it'd be hilarious if the dog said, "Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm writing a book with Chris."
Yeah. I think Chris even says something at one point like, "She's really brilliant." He talks about like she's a colleague or something. She's intelligent. This is totally an aside, but in real life, that dog did not like Vinnie Coran, the actor who plays Chris. She just didn't really care for him. And so when she runs up to him, like when he's sitting on the mattress, I guess he was actually sitting on a bunch of jerky treats so that she would actually go over there. And I think it's one of the filmmakers, it was their family dog. Yeah. And I guess she was really afraid of the cameras and stuff too. She didn't really, which kind of worked out because at one point she does kind of look at the camera and then skitter out of the cabin. So, But she actually, in the movie, belongs to this Frenchman, Byron. And Mike goes out after the dog dies and tells this Byron that the dog has passed on, and they sit and talk for a minute. And there are a couple interesting things about the dog dying, because the thing about this movie is that there are stories everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Mike is constantly telling stories that aren't real or that he knows are a lie about the people around him. So when the dog is killed, when he talks to his wife, he doesn't want to worry her, so he says the dog just keeled over from a heart attack or something.
Yeah.
But then when he goes to Byron, he tells him that he found the dog by the side of the road and the coyotes were eating her, so he just brought the tag back to him or whatever.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I guess on one hand, I understand why Mike is telling these lies, but they're told so casually that you can't help but to hook it back into the story. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Byron kind of puts a fine point on this without talking about the dog, in that he's the one that talks about the membranes of reality and how every membrane has a beginning, middle, and end. And sometimes when he looks at what he calls the infinite or something, he can see all those membranes. That's going to come up in the sequel.
Okay.
And so the actor who plays Byron, Bill Oberst Jr., is fantastic in this movie.
Yeah, he is.
He's just so great. And I know I've seen him in other things. I just don't recall where they were.
He kind of looks like Viggo Mortensen with terrible skin.
Yeah. And
smaller.
But he's fantastic in this part. And he's funny because he's an archaeologist, and he says, I study people, but I don't like to live with them.
Yeah.
But we also find out here at least a theory about where all the AV equipment in this shed, this magical shed that Mike finds that has, it has record players, it has projectors, it has film projectors, slide projectors, VCRs and TVs.
And they all still work.
Yeah, it's basically like a Best Buy of sheds. But so he finds that, and in this scene with Byron, we kind of find out where that stuff maybe comes from. And it's from these two French students that Byron came to the woods with 30 years prior. And they were actually there to study the folk tales of the area. But then they start arguing with one another, accusing each other of stealing their research and all this stuff, until one day the argument just went into the woods and they were never seen again.
Right.
So that's kind of this background story that we can kind of apply to maybe some of the films that we see, like the one of the man and the woman who are bloodied up and they're dressed in a suit. He's in a suit and she's in a dress, and it looks really old. And they look at the camera, even though who would be running the camera at a time like this, like that kind of thing.
Right.
We kind of get some backstory that feeds into these little snippets of stories that Michael's been getting a hold of all along, with all these pictures and stuff that are being left for him. But one thing in this scene that I thought was a really good commentary on Michael's character is the mirror. Because they're sitting at this RV table across from each other, and Byron holds up this mirror and he angles it so that it's looking into another mirror on the wall behind Michael, and it creates the infinity effect.
Right.
And that's what he's talking about, the layers of between universes and that kind of thing. But then when he turns it towards Michael and basically tells Michael that, like, it's kind of his job to be the end of the story or whatever, Michael refuses to look in that mirror. And that's the thing that's interesting about Michael. He encounters mirrors like 2 or 3 times in this movie. And the only time, he'll never look at himself in the mirror. Like when he's in the antique shop, he comes up really close to this mirror that he's interested in, but he won't look himself in the eye in the mirror at all. The only time that we really see him kind of look head on in the mirror is when he feels the entity standing behind him, which is us, and he looks the entity or the camera in the eye through the mirror, but he never looks at himself. And I think that's interesting because as you go on, you find out that Michael has an idea of himself that turns out to be false. You know, he sees himself as this creative person who's made it, and who is out there to save his friend. But in reality, it's all about him and the friend that he went to save. The stories he's told himself about Chris as his friend growing up aren't real either. Like, it's all about these stories that we tell ourselves. And Michael is the one in the movie that says the word story over and over again.
Yeah.
So
it's like he's got a sense of shame.
He does. He does have a sense of shame. And I think that it's very, well, I was going to say it's indicative of what the filmmakers are trying to say.
Yeah.
But, I don't think they were trying to say that. I mean, I don't, I don't know. I mean, I think that comes out by accident because I've heard the commentary to this movie.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of high-fiving and half-told production stories. And that's kind of it. It's they allude to every time Michael says the word story, for instance. But they say, oh, that might mean something, that might mean something. They kind of use all that stuff as a plot device, but they don't actually talk about the deeper meaning of the movie, really even at the end.
Yeah.
So I guess we should finish the story, as we're talking about stories anyway. We should finish the story, but I do want to come back to the idea the filmmakers not really addressing the big issue, because I think that's important.
Yeah.
So Michael, basically what happens is that he and Chris, things start to escalate with them getting pieces of footage, and the pieces of footage become them being killed in various ways, and they try to escape. And in trying to escape, basically what happens is that the tweakers, Billy and Micah, end up in the cabin while Michael and Chris are watching from a hiding place at night far away. And Charles and his guys come. They find the tweakers in the cabin because time's passed, everybody should be out of there. And they kill the tweakers and burn the place. I'm not exactly sure why they burned the place. Maybe to hide evidence?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's kind of weird.
Maybe, yeah.
Because at one point, Charles, when he's talking to Michael early on, or about midway through, Michael asks him why he doesn't just rent the cabin out. And he said it burned down once and we couldn't afford to rebuild. You figure out the answer for that in the sequel as well. Why it burns, but it's always still there. So the sequel is good to answer a lot of questions and resolution, but personally, I prefer this movie over that movie.
Okay.
But that is a good movie. So ultimately, once this all happens and the place is burning down, Chris makes a run for the cabin. I don't know if he's trying to save his drugs, if he's trying to kill himself, if he's trying to save his guns. I don't know what he's doing. But they get up in front of the house, and then the camera, we're looking at them as if the burning cabin is behind us. Mm-hmm. And we see the fire glow on them, and then the camera just stands up. And the membrane kind of pierces, and these two guys look at the screen, and you realize that this is the entity looking at them now.
Right.
And then Chris, of course, falls to his knees, and Mike, basically asks if they could do it another way, and then it cuts off. And it's gone. So that is a very long-winded, terrible retelling of this movie. Please go watch it for yourself.
It's a hard movie to describe unless you do it like we typically do it on our double features, where you break it down scene by scene. But it's a hard movie to describe because it's very all over the place.
Yeah,
there's a lot of different things going on, and they meet later on at the end. So,
well, like I said too, like this movie is on Amazon Prime right now. You could go on Amazon and buy this DVD Blu-ray combo for $7.
Yeah.
I mean, don't buy it for the commentary. But unless you're a bro, that's cool. If you're a bro, I get it. But speaking of bros, there are two other characters in this movie that I forgot to talk about.
Okay.
Three other characters, actually, but two of them are really important. The UFO cultists down by the creek, right?
Yeah.
So at one point early on, Michael's taking a walk, and he walks down by this creek, and he sees these three guys who are dressed in khakis and white button-down shirts, and one of them has a black turtleneck on under his white button-down shirt.
Yeah.
And you can tell they're cultists right away. And Michael just tries to pass them quickly without engaging, but they stop him, and they want to talk. These three guys are named Justin and Aaron and David.
Mm-hmm.
Justin and Aaron are the co-directors of the film. And Justin is Justin Benson. Aaron Scott Moorhead is Aaron. And Justin is the writer of the script, but then he's also the co-director of the film with Aaron Scott Moorhead. And the interesting thing about these three guys is that Justin and Aaron are the main characters in the sequel. So that's how this kind of gets started. And then the story from Resolution kind of trickles in a little bit here and there into the larger Endless story. Because the Endless story is a bit more explicit about what's going on.
Right.
The other interesting thing about the UFO cult angle of this movie is that according to the filmmakers, there actually was a millennial cult that just lived across the creek and over the hill from where they filmed this.
Yeah.
From what they said, they sounded kind of like a doomsday snake handling type affair, you know? Because this is in San Diego, so I think if you could probably go out in the woods around in California, spend anywhere and throw a rock and you'd hit a cult. But
sure.
That's me giving my 1970s take on current.
Also coming from a man who's never been to San Diego.
That's true. That's true. I've never been to San Diego. And I probably never will. You know that state's going to fall off into the sea, right?
That's what I hear, yeah.
So there are a few things about this movie I kind of love. One big thing, I think, is that Michael and Chris's relationship feels very lived in.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I didn't necessarily feel like the relationships between the characters in the first Evil Dead felt really lived in like this one does. What did you think about that?
I think so. I mean, it felt like these two guys had known each other for a long time. You know, they had a kind of unspoken chemistry between the two.
Right.
The first Evil Dead, especially with the unlikable characters in that movie, it just seemed like that they were just high school friends that you know, get together once in a while and do something.
Right.
Whereas these two, they definitely seem like they grew up together. You know, especially when they start to have conversations after he finally frees him from the cabin.
Yeah.
And they're hiding out waiting for shit to go down.
Yeah.
The conversations that they're having there, you know, they definitely feel like they've been friends for a long time and that it was a true friendship.
I think, too, it's interesting that you say that because the filmmakers actually talk about this, how these guys actually use their friendship and they kind of pivot away all this bizarre stuff that's happening in scenes. Like something bizarre will happen, but then Chris is almost always the one that's just like, come on, man. Like, I'm chained to a wall here and I'm detoxing and I feel like shit. And he pivots it away. I thought that was great for this movie because unlike the Evil Dead movie, which is structured as a nightmare, right?
Yeah.
In this movie, it goes the opposite direction. It's one of those dreams where you feel like it's a normal day and you're going to the grocery store and then you get in your car and there's an alien in the back seat saying, hey, can we go to Five Guys Burgers or something?
Yeah.
It's different in that the nightmare sneaks up on you in this movie a bit more. So I think that their relationship actually works really well with that. But it was really weird to hear the filmmakers talk about how these guys pivot away from the bizarre stuff and talk about mundane stuff because according to Benson and Moorhead, they were saying, well, it's really just because guys don't like to freak out in front of other guys. And I'm just like, okay, well, Chris freaks out multiple times in this movie in front of Michael. Yeah. But here's a question I have.
Okay.
I'm going to make a big assumption here.
Okay.
That means we'll probably never get to interview these two filmmakers.
Okay.
Let's assume these guys are shallow guys.
Okay.
The guys who made this film. Okay. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing to be shallow. You know, I think a lot of us are in our heads too much. So there's nothing wrong with that.
Sure.
However, when you see a movie that somebody makes, but you listen to them and realize that they may not have thought as deeply about the movie as what you're reading from it, does that invalidate the way you feel about the movie or the things that you read from it?
I don't think so. I think that you draw what you want from a movie. You see it as you see it.
Yeah.
It's like whenever an artist writes a song and one of their fans comes to him and says, I feel like you wrote that song just for me.
Right.
Well, obviously they didn't.
Right.
In this case with the movie, maybe they did have a lot in mind of what you had in mind about the movie. Some of the deep aspects of it, some of the different layers, some of the commentary on culture,
right,
all of that. maybe they did have that in mind when they wrote it. For their sake, it would be better if they would have conveyed that in the commentary rather than just high-five each other.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know. I don't think it necessarily invalidates it. If that were the case, I'd probably hate every Quentin Tarantino movie because I can't stand him.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there.
No one loves Quentin Tarantino more than Quentin Tarantino.
Right.
But I do love a good percentage of his movies.
Right.
There's some I don't like, but aside from that, I think his movies are all, in one way or another, pretty great.
Yeah.
In this case, I feel like there had to be a lot of thought put into this, and not just how are we going to put this movie together, but there had to be some sort of deeper meaning to it. They're just not conveying it.
Yeah.
But again, we could read very deeply into Stop or My Mom Will Shoot.
Yeah.
Knowing full well that there's nothing to fully look, deeply into as far as that movie's concerned. But we could.
Next week on the All Night Drive-In Picture Show. Stop or My Mom Will Shoot.
Doubled up with Oscar.
Yeah, or Rhinestone.
Yeah.
At least Rhinestone has Dolly Parton in it.
That's true. She's a treasure.
Well, I see. Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. I mean, I haven't listened to the commentary for The Endless, so maybe these guys had that in mind all along. Listening to their commentary here, I'm on the fence about whether they did or didn't. They seem to avoid it just like the characters seem to avoid dealing with the increasingly bizarre things that were happening to them.
Yeah.
But the thing that I wondered is that even if the filmmakers didn't necessarily think about the deeper meaning of what they were writing here, right? It's the difference between creating a watch that works and creating a Swiss watch or a steampunk watch that's a work of art, right?
Right.
And that has things in specific places for specific reasons other than just to tell the time.
Yeah.
But with this, it made me wonder if the filmmakers were kind of avoiding talking about the deeper meaning in the commentary while also acknowledging that the characters are avoiding talking about these important things while they're in the midst of this crisis, right? Mm-hmm. What does that then say about us as a society? And I know that sounds like some real live academic masturbation, but give me a second. Do we have the odd denial reaction that the filmmakers had in the commentary or that the characters had in their scenes together, Michael and Chris, when we're confronted with existential problems, like problems that actually are going to affect if we're going to live or die? Do we tend to pivot away? And I'm specific, you know what I'm thinking about here? Like,
I do.
I'm thinking about stuff like climate change, stuff like, epidemics, politics, religion.
I hear there may be an epidemic coming up.
I've heard something about it, but I've also heard that the fake news says the numbers are really low. So yeah,
it's called like the Wu-Tang Budweiser bug or something like that.
It's a
really odd name.
It's Miller Lite 19 is the name of that. But it's the age-old thing where people say, "Oh, keep politics out of it," right? Like, let's keep politics out of this. This is no time for politics, and it's kind of like, or this is no time to. Well, like with this thing that's going on now, this is no time to bring politics into this. But it's like, yeah, but political leaders directly affect what's happening here.
Right.
So I guess what I'm getting at is that there might be some sort of unwitting commentary on our society in this movie, in that these guys wrote these snappy scenes between these friends just because they could, but maybe they themselves aren't aware of the societal commentary that they're creating, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Because isn't it disheartening? Like, you've met some musicians, right, in your lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
I've met a few musicians, a couple filmmakers. It's always super disappointing when that person is vapid or kind of dumb, or maybe not even dumb. That's harsh. Inarticulate, let's say. Say they just can't articulate what they're thinking. I get that. It's disappointing, but it also kind of makes me think about another aspect of this movie that I want to ask you about.
Okay.
Does this movie, in the way that it makes us the entity that is craving all of these stories, in making us the POV of that entity, does it kind of also make another comment about how we treat the people that we watch on television and what we expect characters to go through in movies and TV shows, but also extending to what we expect of the actors who play those characters. And then it extends further to what we expect of reality stars and what they do with their lives. And then that extends to politicians and the way that we conduct elections is more of like personality popularity contests than something that's actually about anything resembling principles or ethics or policies. Like, do you think that there's something here that, again, the filmmakers never talk about, but watching it, it certainly to me felt that way? Because this thing delivers on all these different mediums of quote-unquote entertainment, it made me feel like there was something there about how we consume this movie that we're consuming.
And not just current media, but age-old medium too.
Yeah,
media too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like, you know, reel-to-reel film. And
right.
And
78 records, you know.
Grainy black and white photographs.
Right.
Yeah, like way back.
Right. And
yeah, I think there's a lot to that. Just because it's naturally ingrained in our lives. Even though we have a love-hate relationship with it nowadays. You and I are big pro wrestling fans.
Yeah.
And that'll get dropped into this podcast here and there because, like, you know, baseball or football or basketball is ingrained in some people's lives and they bring it up in certain situations. That's what we end up doing.
Right, sure.
You know, we can equate a lot to that. Pro wrestling's not for everybody, obviously, but it's a fascinating form of entertainment for us.
Sure.
And the things that go on behind the scenes in wrestling are often more fascinating than what goes on the screen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you know, we have come to, since we've watched wrestling over 30 years, each of us, we've come to expect certain things with wrestling that we end up not getting most of the time.
Yeah.
You know, things that seem obvious and we don't get it.
Right.
And most of the time it's bad storytelling, but also there's politics involved in it too.
Right.
As to why so-and-so, you know, gets the title and why so-and-so is getting pushed in front of the fans' eyes, you know, to be a bigger star when they don't really deserve it. I kind of feel like that's what this story is kind of about too, because in the end, you're the entity, basically.
Yeah.
And you're saying, I don't like how this ended, you know?
Yeah.
You need to do it a different way to satisfy me.
Right, right.
So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a commentary, I believe, on what we as a society demand of certain things.
Yeah.
Of what we demand in our entertainment, what we demand of our politicians and so forth.
Right.
Like you mentioned earlier, you know, it's not a good time to talk about this. Well, as we've discovered with politics, it's never a good time to talk about anything important.
Right, right.
It's only important to talk about the things that are going to make them money.
Right.
So I absolutely feel like this movie is saying a lot of that. And if the filmmakers don't see that, it's obvious. It's got to be something subconscious with them.
Right.
It would have to be, I would
Right.
think. And I'll be honest with you. Some of the stuff that you brought to my attention, I didn't think about either. When you explain it and I start to think about it, it makes 100% sense.
Yeah.
Some of it I gleaned from it, but a lot of it I didn't. So yeah, I mean, when you put together a movie as complex as this, and with the choose your own adventure aspect of it too, something we didn't really talk about, I don't think, was that when they're in the cabin, you know, there's certain media that they see that shows them how they could possibly die.
Right.
One of them is he's got his laptop with him at all times, and the laptop's got a camera.
Right. Right.
And at one point, the camera gets covered up, but it's still recording, and he doesn't know that.
Right.
And then Chris is just not believing anything, basically, that Michael's telling him. He thinks he's feeding him a line of shit, or he's hallucinating because he's withdrawing from the drugs. And then you see the laptop fire up, and they see themselves get murdered from the point of view of the camera on the laptop.
Right.
Or they see something that just happened, but from a different point of view. Like,
yeah,
Michael's out on the deck grilling up some food.
Yeah.
And you see like a point of view from somebody that's got a camera maybe 30 feet away from him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Chris is like, how are you doing this? It's like, I'm not doing this, you know?
That right there, I'm glad you brought that up because that's a fascinating scene because
in
that
very
scene,
much.
It's interesting because Michael's first inclination is to go look outside. Who's filming us?
Yeah.
And then Chris's whole thing is, again, to kind of pivot to the mundane, to say, oh, it's probably some tweaker. It could be Billy and Micah, you know.
Right.
But then Chris goes off into conspiracy theories. Oh, it's the satellites.
Right.
They could do anything, you know, and it's kind of like the crackhead, meth head fantasy psychosis. You know, I think Michael even says at one point you're in like an addict psychosis or something like that, which also kind of mirrors our society, right? In that sometimes you have things that are very obvious that this should not be happening if there's nobody outside filming you and there's nobody inside. There could be an outlandish explanation, but the outlandish explanation is not something that's both outlandish and mundane necessarily, you know?
Right.
So like, for instance, let's just take a for instance. This is not a knock on these people, because I, for one, am a big fan of conspiracy theory books and UFO books and stuff like that, because I like those stories, oddly enough. I don't know that I believe any of it, but I like the stories, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't like reading science fiction writers. I just don't.
Yeah.
But the thing is that in our society right now, you could have something that's very obvious, right? There's a very obvious problem. There's a very obvious set of possible solutions. And yet you have people that are saying it's the satellites in the sky, or you're having somebody say, oh, it's just this person out here filming it. And neither one of them are right, but there's another obvious thing right in front of them that they're not considering because it's too big for them to consider. And it takes too much effort for them to consider. But they have real world shit that's going on, and it prevents them from wanting to take on this bigger existential question. They just don't want to consider it. They want to deal with what they can deal with. And I get that. You know, it just, like in this movie, the story will just keep starting over and over again, and we see things repeat themselves all the time in history. Most of the time, not even in mystical or even coincidental ways. It's just because we always seem to kind of act the same way when we get to a certain point, and then it starts over again, and then it starts over again, and we forget, or we just we're willfully ignorant about something, and it starts over again. I love this movie, right? But to me, it's kind of unfortunate that this movie had to be made, because it really kind of, watching it, makes me think about all the Instagram influencers out there, and the YouTube influencers, and people like that who are telling these stories about their lives that may or may not be destructive to them and to other people. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that way if we could just be honest with ourselves. I think that's the thing that like really bothers me in a good way about this movie. That makes any sense, you know? Like, you ever been bothered by a movie in a good way? Like, the way a good documentary will bother you about something, I think. This movie bothers me in a good way. But it also makes me sad, I think, in the end. Yeah. Like, I as much as I love this movie, and trust me, I love this movie. I watched it.
Revenge of the Ninja.
Yeah. Hey, you know, sometimes I just want to turn off from the rat race and watch the ninjas do impossible things. I'm a pro wrestling fan, ladies and gentlemen. Got a lot of stuff going on my plate here. And on that happy note, what would you say about this movie? If somebody were asking you if this is a good movie, what would you say?
Oh, it definitely is. Yeah.
You think so?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it a lot. When it came down to it, I know that a lot of people that I might possibly recommend this movie to, or people, you know, it's like, you got any good movie suggestions? Yeah, try this Resolution. I know I wouldn't enjoy trying to explain the ending to them.
I've learned not to answer that question anymore. Yeah. The second people find out you like movies, they say, well, hey, what, did you see anything good lately? And if I know the person well enough, I'd say, oh, you know what, I've seen this thing. You might dig that. But if I don't, I just say, you know, lots of good stuff out there. Because what do? You know, you end up, if nowadays especially, but it maybe has always been like this, if you say you like a movie and suggest it to somebody, 8 times out of 10 you end up defending that movie to someone.
Right.
And I'm just too tired. I got too much other stuff going on to defend why I like something to somebody. Even you about Revenge of the Ninja, sir.
Well, I know what you mean, because if somebody asked, last year I was all about Hereditary. I love that movie.
Right.
And I know you didn't necessarily like it as much as I did, or at all for that matter.
No, I thought it was good, but
yeah,
I
really love that movie. And this year the director Ari Aster's follow-up was Midsummer, which I also really enjoyed.
Yeah.
So I know a couple of instances where somebody asked if, to recommend something to him, and I would recommend Hereditary, and they'd come back to me and they're like, why did you enjoy that? It's like, well, you asked. I mean,
yeah. Yeah.
No, it's definitely not a movie for everyone, or it's definitely maybe a movie for 10% of the population.
Right.
But what one person enjoys, another one won't, obviously.
Yeah.
If you want me to go more mainstream, I could do that. But
of course, you get to see more mainstream movies than I do.
Right.
I mean, right, at the beginning, like right away, because I'm mostly stuck here in the projection shack. We don't run first run movies out here. I mean, a lot of times for me, I haven't seen something, so I just don't. If people ask, hey, you see anything good lately? What I end up giving them is something that they've never heard of and probably don't give a shit about.
Right.
And it's not because I want to be some sort of film snob. It's just because I just don't have access to going to a theater.
Right.
So that's just how that works out. But, you get the puzzled look, and I got tired of seeing the puzzled look. So I'm kind of like, oh, well, I don't know. What are you excited about seeing? Or there's all kinds of great stuff out there. Or, hey, where's that turkey sandwich I ordered? Just kidding. I can't eat turkey. So overall, we've gone into this whole thing about how we don't like to recommend movies to people.
Yeah.
You would recommend Resolution to, say, our people here.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe too.
If you're listening to us, then you're the type of movie watcher that would appreciate a movie like this, I think.
Yeah, I think so too.
And it's not like we're showing you, Bertolucci or something. We're showing you a little bit of everything.
There's nothing
and if you
There's nothing wrong with Bertolucci. What's wrong with you?
No,
what are you talking
no,
about?
I'm not. I wasn't saying there was. I'm saying Bertolucci is.
It sounded like you were saying something about Bertolucci there.
No, I'm saying we're not showing movies of that caliber.
Wow.
I'm making fun of us, you asshole.
Wow. Ooh, there's a caste system.
You're right. Revenge of the Ninja is high quality entertainment.
I told you. You didn't believe
You're absolutely
me.
right.
I told you. If Fellini had made a ninja movie, it would have been Revenge of the Ninja. Call Godard.
Yeah.
Call Godard.
Yeah.
We need another ninja movie.
But yeah, anyway, from the type of movies that we show and the type of movies that we cover, if you're listening, I would definitely recommend it, of course. Like you said, it's very thought-provoking. It's very, very interesting to watch. So a lot of really great mechanisms in this.
Yeah.
I'm glad that I watched the trailer before I saw this movie because of the guy in the cave.
Oh, yeah, right.
That scream, if I didn't know it was coming, probably would have made me jump out of my skin.
Yeah. I did not. I did not watch the trailer before I saw this movie.
Yeah. Whew.
I mean, that's an interesting aspect of the movie that we didn't talk about, is that at one point Michael goes into this cave and he finds a cave drawing that ends up being carved by a knife by itself in the cabin, and yet Chris still doesn't want to talk about that. He's just wondering where his knife's been for 2 weeks.
And I like that this movie is so low budget too that you don't see it carve.
Right.
You don't see the knife do the carving.
Right.
You just see it fall to the floor and wake up Michael, who's sleeping next to it.
Right.
But the thing is that you don't need to see it.
No, you don't. It's better if you don't.
Right.
That's the thing, is it's better if you don't. And in the sequel, The Endless, it's a higher budget production. So there's a little less of that. Everything's a bit more explicit.
Yeah.
But it does fill in some of the gaps that are present in this movie. And ultimately, I mean, this isn't giving anything away in The Endless, because they actually talk about this movie. Ultimately, I think they think that it's some sort of mechanism that was recognized by Tesla, wherein something collects the thoughts of the people that are around it and displays them back to them in stories or something like that. And then it goes through your mind and creates all the possible resolutions to your life story that you can think of and displays them to you. I think that's supposed to be kind of the underlying quote-unquote explanation for this, but it's not very explicit in this movie, and I feel like it's even less explicit in The Endless. The Endless kind of goes in a different direction, a little bit of a different direction. But I'd recommend Resolution too. I mean, I think and The Endless. I think they're both fascinating movies. I think people tend to like The Endless a bit more because it's a little more conventional, but yeah, I'd recommend it too.
Check it out.
Maybe do it a double feature with Revenge of the Ninja.
Or Bertolucci, whatever floats your boat.
Whatever floats your boat. Yeah, sure. All right. Let me extend our thank you to friend of the show, Marty, for giving us the print of Resolution that we showed out here tonight. We really appreciate it there, bud.
Coming soon to this drive-in theater.
Next week, we step outside our typical fare to celebrate opening day with a doubleheader exploring the gritty magic and passionate love of baseball in The Sandlot and Bull Durham. That's it for the short reel this week. You can connect with us by following us on social media at All Night Drive-In on Twitter and Instagram, by searching the All Night Drive-In Picture Show on Facebook, and by emailing us at allnightdriveinpictureshow@gmail.com. Please subscribe to and rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcatcher if possible. And more importantly, tell your friends. Sneaking your friends into the show in the trunk is definitely allowed at the All Night Drive-In Picture Show. I mean, Stubbs probably won't like it, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So we'll see you next week on the All Night Drive-In Picture Show. Thanks for listening.
The Short Reel is edited and produced by Markham Harvey. Our theme song is by Burning Mirror and edited by The Night Watch. I'm your announcer, Lila Pseudonym. This has been a Clown Business Coalition production. Thank you and good night.